Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's presentation. Before I go ahead and hand off the presentation to Kevin Cooke, our presenter today, I wanted to cover a bit of housekeeping issues with you all. If you have any questions for our presenter today, please feel free to direct them either via the chat or question window, and we'll do our best to cover everyone's questions as time allows at the end of the presentation. Also, we are recording today's session, so keep an eye on your inbox in the days following the event for a link to the recording that you can use for review or to share with a colleague. So without much ado, I'm going to go ahead and hand this off to Kevin, who's going to take us through today's presentation.
Thank you so much, Ray, and welcome everybody here on this, at least here in the Northeast, sunny day. Haven't had an opportunity to say that very much recently. Wanted to share with you today a very exciting new feature that will be available in Stratusphere UX, a feature called Process Optimizer. Going to dig into that and share a bit about it here in a moment. For those of you not familiar with Liquidware, I want to just take a few moments to share a little bit about Liquidware and our adaptive workspace management suite of products. Predominantly, Liquidware is focused in the end user computing or end user workspace area of the market. We are all about helping you reduce the cost and complexity of your desktop environments, and that is with regard to all Windows delivery, whether physical, virtual, or in the cloud. We very much enable support and help you to optimize and deliver the optimal user experience as it relates to desktop and other workspace delivery, whether virtualized, whether next generation management of physical or cloud. And ultimately, it's about helping organizations to deliver and manage their Windows environments at scale. As I'm sure many of us on this call are aware, when you get to very large numbers and you get to very large Windows environments, there tends to be complexity, and with that complexity comes many challenges. We've got a great and loyal set of customers. Certainly not going to read all of these icons for you, but we've been certainly battle tested, literally. We are present in all branches of the federal government, as well as all branches of our military, and have been in the marketplace now for over a decade. So certainly a great, mature set of products and technologies. Specifically, as it relates to our ability to create a more adaptive workspace, we focus in the areas of user environment management, application layering, and user experience diagnostics, monitoring and diagnostics, or broadly, workspace visibility. We're going to talk today about Stratusphere UX and user experience visibility, and we're even going to pull the covers back a little bit more and talk very specifically about a new feature where we're taking action on the environment and offering some process optimization features. Broadly, Stratusphere UX is our end user workspace diagnostics or workspace analytics platform. We collect metrics and information on every workspace all of the time. So we have a administratively installed connector ID key or agent. This collects information from all of your machines, all of your for all of your users and all of your applications or processes running on all of those machines at whatever administratively defined interval you deem appropriate for your visibility. Similarly, you can hold on to that information and retain that data in our database for as long as you'd like. So you can get long-term trended information over 30, 60, 90 days to be able to identify trends, optimization opportunity. You can use it to baseline and onboard users, perhaps migrating them from physical to virtual or physical to cloud. It is ideal for looking at your applications, defining an application strategy, looking to determine whether something should be in a base image or perhaps layered or virtualized or streamed, etc. And great forensic and troubleshooting capability based on this data set as it relates to performing diagnostics and getting into the heart of your consumption patterns. Broadly, though, what this is all about at the end of the day, it's about looking at your user experience and workspace data as a means to determine and frankly deliver the user experience that meets your business needs, but also meets the expectations of your end user set. And as I said, there's a number of key use cases that I've talked about and highlighted in terms of baselining or onboarding or understanding your application use, etc. But at the end of the day, it's about minimizing risk in the delivery of your next generation workspaces and ensuring that you're meeting user experience and delivering what is necessary for you to both meet your business goals, but also meet your user expectations. So with that, we're going to drill in today and talk about this new performance management feature or process optimization feature in Stratusphere UX. And I'm going to ask you to perhaps go along with me on a journey to highlight the complexity and some of the changes and frankly, some of the barriers that we see today in the marketplace in terms of being able to optimally deliver performance and optimally manage your Windows environments to that end. Certainly, to do any of the things that we've talked about today, it requires complete visibility, end-to-end visibility, being able to see, in the case of a physical PC, it's everything going on in that PC, as well as the connectivity and some of the network attributes as it relates to other services, other network applications, and other components of the infrastructure required for success. Think things like DNS, think things like Active Directory, et cetera, et cetera. When you get into more complex platforms, virtual platforms, on-prem platforms, now we're talking about servers, storage, data center infrastructure, pods of Citrix and VMware and Nutanix Frame and other types of software platform sets. And then moving into the cloud, of course, we've got all of the various workspaces available from Microsoft and VMware and Amazon and Google, etc. And so when we get into these more complex virtual environments, it's all about knowing your consumption patterns and understanding what's going on within the Windows environment to ensure you're delivering those key attributes. Consumption and detailed metrics are key to both near-term and long-term success. Near-term meaning things like migrations or changes in application delivery or changes in the platform or your image strategy. And long-term, it's about the operationalization and ensuring that you're continuing to meet the goals, right? Users have changing and ever-evolving consumption patterns, whether that's due to applications that change, things that you may be in more control of, or business climate changes, whereas the types of applications or the usage patterns for those applications may change. All of these things have an effect ultimately on the both consumption patterns and the resources required to meet the need and meet those consumption patterns. So protection from both planned, things that you know or you're putting into place, and unplanned for issues really becomes critical. Let's take a look or talk specifically about some of the barriers and some of the things that we've seen. And I've put them in a couple of key buckets. We're going to talk about these four things here for the next handful of slides. But what I'm hoping you'll see is that there are real barriers to success. Some are technological barriers. Some are behavioral barriers. Some are simply business-focused barriers based on business goals or business changes or business climate changes that are going to have an effect on the user experience. And then, of course, there's the catch-all, things that you just simply can't plan for that happen even with all of the due diligence and all of the efforts that you put into place. So we're going to talk about each of these here for a moment. First, let's talk about Windows and resource consumption, right? Windows has been around for quite a while. I was fortunate enough in my professional career to see Windows come on the scene. I started back in the days of Windows 3 and trying to get that networked. And wow, wasn't it awesome when we had Windows for work groups and there was some networking capabilities in there. But the march of Windows has continued to evolve for the last almost 20 years now. And what's interesting is there have been obvious resource and consumption changes throughout all of those and various time frames, right? From Windows XP to Windows Vista, we saw a good chunk of time. And since most folks jumped over and went to 7, we're talking about almost a decade before we saw a significant major release from Windows XP to Windows 7. Windows 7 to 8 was more compressed, and we saw just a handful of years. And then 8 to 10, even fewer still, right? The curve has gotten more asymptotic, if you will, as we've marched forward, and the pace of change within the Windows environment has happened faster. The point here, though, that's important is there has been a resource consumption change at the same time, and the march of hardware was able to, in many cases, keep pace with the march of software, the operating system. So think about the usage patterns and how often you were refreshing your desktop hardware infrastructure and how often you were replacing your desktops, your desktop refresh cycle. And in many cases, it aligned with or happened in a very similar time frame to the march of Windows itself. Well, not so much the case with Windows 10. Windows 10 was supposed to be sort of the last version of Windows, and certainly we have the Windows 10 moniker that's been around for quite some time. But when you look at the major Windows releases, whether it's releases back in 2015 with 1507, 1511, upwards of the more recent 1809 and 1903, Windows 10 is coming at a significantly faster pace. In fact, on average, we're seeing 2 a year, almost every 6 months, again, on pace with what Microsoft has promised us. But the point being, far more frequent than the pace of Windows major releases prior. And we're seeing the pace of the Windows OS happening faster than those hardware refresh cycles that we were able to align with previously. So what does this all mean, right? Ultimately, who cares, Kevin? Great. That's pretty obvious. Well, there's a number of folks out there, and I'm calling out one in particular, a gentleman by the name of Daniel Feller. Daniel has been looking at Windows resource consumption, specifically Windows 10 resource utilization over many of those builds that have been going on. There's a number of folks who have done this, but Dan wrote an interesting blog and has made public some of this information. There's a link to the source material down at the bottom of the page. And again, without surprise, we're seeing at least a 10-point jump in CPU and RAM, and even bigger in terms of disk IOPS and disk requirements. But the broad stroke message here is the pace of Windows consumption is increasing, and that pace of Windows consumption is increasing at a faster rate than most folks are refreshing their hardware. This is important. This is something that we should be paying attention to. And if you are delivering Windows and looking to deliver Windows in an optimal way, it means you're going to need to be tuning and optimizing and paying attention to what these consumption patterns look like, what your usage patterns look like, and even more so, this is going to become a challenge when you're looking at virtualized on-prem or cloud-based platforms, whereby now we've got aggregate or groups of these Windows workspaces that are consuming additional resources, which are changing densities, which are changing both consumption patterns, but ultimately changing usage patterns as it relates to availability, as it relates to sizing, as it relates to crafting and creating the optimal hardware infrastructure or platform infrastructure to support these Windows resources. The message here that's really important as it relates to Windows and resource consumption is even when optimized, there will be an increase in the resource consumption over both the near and the long term, given the state of change and given the pace of change. provided to us by Microsoft in the evolution of Windows 10. The second point I want to talk about, and there's four. The second point I want to talk about is the move to virtual and cloud-based workspaces broadly. Now, I'm not making a commentary about cloud, whether it's good or bad, or physical, whether it's good or bad. I'm simply making the point that the divide between physical desktop resources and cloud-based resources is pretty significant. And not just cloud, I should say physical resources when you have a physical PC deployed, and virtual resources, whether that's shared host infrastructure on-prem, think VDI, think terminal services, think RDS types of applications and application delivery strategies. It's whether you're doing physical PCs or whether you're doing virtually delivered workspaces, the divide between those two is becoming quite large. Again, pretty obvious, right? I mean, think about Moore's Law, think about all kinds of things. And I'm not saying anything that should be profoundly upsetting or jarring to you. But the point being, it's critical for you now to keep these things in mind as it relates to what individual users have available to them and how that's going to affect both the management and optimization, but more importantly, what their user experience is going to be. So by way of example, or by way of making this point, I went out to Dell, not singling them out for any particular reason, but I went out to Dell and I looked for sort of a middle-of-the-road desktop type of system. And I chose the Dell 5070. It's available in a couple of different hardware form factors, but the point here is most of the middle-of-the-road enterprise class desktop systems are now consuming between 6, or deliver, I should say, between 6 and 8 CPU cores. So we're talking about, standard Intel i5, i7 types of devices. Most of them come standard now with 8, in many cases 16 gig of RAM. They all have a local hard drive. They all have some type of dedicated GPU, whether it's a GPU card or whether it's a GPU chip function that's integrated into their motherboard. Now, by way of contrast, let's look at the average cloud-delivered desktop. And I went up to Amazon and some of their AWS standard delivery tiers, and their standard desktop is 2 vCPUs. vCPU is roughly analogous to 2 cores. Most of them have 4 gig of RAM. They're all leveraging shared storage, so there's typically no local storage. It's all virtualized storage, and it's leveraging a shared infrastructure within the cloud. In the case of AWS, it's likely your S3 that's now being mounted and or made available to these virtual desktops. And there's really no dedicated GPU at some of these average or standard tiers. There are GPU tiers available if you go into some of the highest level Amazon AWS tiers, but we're talking a completely different pricing schedule. I'm speaking broadly about sort of the average, middle-of-the-road types of devices. What should be pretty stark and in your face here is these are profoundly different hardware resources that are available to an end user. And if you deliver exactly the same image to both of these two different platforms, each of those users will get a very different user experience. So again, I'm not making a comment about physical is better, but making a comment that you need to be aware of these consumption patterns, and you need to be aware of what's delivered based on the different platforms that you're choosing to deliver your Windows environment atop. And if you are constrained, for example, you've got a cloud, you've got a virtual on-prem or virtual environment that's coming from an Amazon or a Google or a Microsoft, you need to be aware of the fact that there may be user experience constraints or user experience issues if you're not paying very close attention. Of course, virtual and cloud are going to offer you a profound management and profound operational benefit. There's no doubt that looking at cloud-based and virtual on-prem based delivery affords you things that we could never hope to accomplish in the physical world. whether that's security related, whether that's compliance related, whether that's shifting to an OpEx versus a CapEx model, right? There are many, many great business and management reasons why you want to make that change, but it's really critical to understand that resources are not as bountiful. You do not have the almost limitless resource that you do presently when you move to these kinds of environments. That's point number 2. The third is about user behaviors and speaking really about the way in which users are going to consume resources that are made available to them and what that looks like and how that's going to translate to performance and an optimal experience based on the different delivery modalities that we've spoken about here. Users are really good at surprising you in ever unexpected ways. I am on a lot of customer calls with our field sales team, and it never ceases to amaze me the things that users will try to do or figure out a way to do or seek out and find either loopholes or find issues or cracks in the armor of your delivery mechanism. And regardless of how much time you spend hardening, regardless of how much time you spend locking down, regardless of how much time you spend buttoning up your environment, there will still be holes that can be exploited. And I'm not saying it's something that users are going out of their way to do, but listen, users will find a way, right? It's going to happen. And even when you tune and optimize these applications, they can and will grow beyond the resources that are made available to you. Let me bring up one by way of example. So by way of example, I recently looked at Chrome in our own environment. And what you see here on the screen is from Stratusphere and our workspace analytics and our data sets that we can collect over time. I've looked at Chrome consumption metrics across many of the users and many of the machines on our own environment. And these are aggregate numbers over a period of time. This is not a single time slice or a single day. It's a multi-day, multi-week, in fact, data set that you're looking at. But the point is, when you look at Chrome consumption and you look at how Chrome behaves as an application over time, it's pretty significant. And even when you constrain some of the patterns or some of the usage, so for example, you give someone a limited amount of RAM or you give them a limited amount of CPU, the environment will still adapt to allow Chrome to do whatever the user wants it to do. What do I mean by that? If you don't give Chrome enough CPU, you'll start to see CPU queuing. If you don't give enough RAM, you will start to see page faults, and you will start to see things writing to disk and paging to disk to support a dearth or a lack of memory availability. And so even when you constrain things like CPU, you constrain things like RAM, you're still going to see increases in other areas that you're unable to fully constrain and fully unable to bound as it relates to the resource consumption. And again, I'm not trying to pick on Google, I'm not trying to pick on Chrome, but understand that these patterns and some applications will grow far beyond what you've provisioned. So just because you've provisioned an application or just because you've provisioned a workspace to have a limited amount of resources available to it does not mean that there are also going to be applications that are going to grow and consume and still create user experience challenges for you. The next that I'll talk about are sort of more spontaneous. And what I mean by this is, listen, we're all going to do our due diligence. We're all going to look and put into place best practices, I hope. We're all going to look to optimize and take advantage of some of the best practices in the marketplace in terms of being able to identify potential known issues where you may have risk and mitigate them. That said, mishaps will happen, and they're going to happen at the least from the least expected place and at the worst possible time. Again, not to pick on Google, but if we were live, I'd ask by a show of hands how many of you have heard of the software reporter tool that comes packaged and is turned on by default when you install Chrome. Well, you've probably, if you've been bitten by it, then certainly you've probably spent some time Googling to see how you can deal with it. But I'll cut to the chase here. Software Reporter Tool is something packaged, quote unquote, for free from Google. It's capturing statistics on where you go, what you consume when you go. It's, collecting a whole bunch of anonymized information, and it's sending it up to Google. Isn't that nice? It can and does spike CPU. It can and does consume large amounts of RAM, and it can and does create a pretty serious effect from a user experience standpoint on individual users, regardless of whether that's a physical device or a virtual device. So being able to quickly mitigate the effects of these kinds of background processes, these kinds of background applications, has become very, very important. Whether it's malware, whether it's intentional malware, whether it's something that isn't really all that nefarious, but you just didn't count on it, having a safety net or some kind of risk process in place to mitigate the effects of these kinds of applications is really, really important in your complete and total arsenal to optimize performance and ensure you're delivering the user experience that people are expecting from you. So how does this relate to Stratusphere, and how does this relate to performance management overall? As I said, Stratusphere with version 6.1.3, this version of Stratusphere is going to be shipping and will be available really imminently. We've pretty much finished up all our work. We're in the process of making it available for our customers to download, for our customers to upgrade and install. But this next version of Stratusphere will include a new feature called Process Optimization. Process Optimization is included with our connector ID key, and it allows you to optimize and focus on those applications that are being run by your users and ensure that those applications are given priority for CPU and RAM consumption. Again, it's about focusing on those applications that are the most meaningful at any point in time and ensuring with very easy management, very easy deployment, that those applications are given the resources or given resource priority when there becomes a constraint in an environment, when there becomes some issue as it relates to resource availability and resource availability as it relates to performance. Process optimization works by minimizing the negative effects of those CPU-intensive background applications. It stops those background applications from monopolizing CPU resources. We have a few different profiles or settings that make it very easy for you to deploy this and ensure that you're setting the appropriate aggressiveness. And it's an intelligent optimization. And what I mean by that is, rather than just flushing RAM in the way that Windows would flush CPU or RAM when it reaches OS-defined thresholds, we're looking at it on a process level, and we're helping to specifically prioritize only those processes that are being used and utilized ultimately by the end user, and those that are in the background are freed up with laser precision. It allows us to avoid some of the more jarring effects of memory management in the native Windows install by tackling this in a more intelligent, more optimized fashion. Where appropriate, this feature can also increase the base priority of in-focused applications to ensure that those applications are giving the resources that they require. So you can include specific applications that are always raised in priority. You can include applications that are always lowered. You can outright kill applications that you don't ever to want run. And I've got Solitaire and Minesweeper here, but maybe it's that Google data collection tool that you just don't ever want to see running that you want to omit here. But ultimately, it's a set it and forget it, very easy way for you to look at optimization of your platform and deliver it with a technology and in a feature set that adds absolutely no more overhead for existing Stratusphere UX customers. If you're already leveraging Stratusphere as your diagnostics, as your monitoring, as your user lifecycle visibility solution, this is an added feature with zero overhead, or just say zero additional overhead. Let's talk about some of the specific use cases or benefits both to users and administrators. So we've talked about lessening the effects of CPU-intensive applications. Of course, as we know, the way that Windows manages resources when the RAM for a specific when a specific application's CPU use is curbed, the associated RAM is also curbed. So we're getting a pull-through effect of not just affecting the CPU availability, but also of affecting RAM utilization and RAM availability. This is great for reducing slow or unresponsive applications by deprioritizing those that are not in focus, as well as ensuring that you elevate applications where that's appropriate. We've seen many customers who recognize and have leveraged early versions of this that we've made available to extend the life of their older PCs. So perhaps you've got another 6 months or another 3/4 of a year before you're able to do a hardware refresh. As we talked about earlier, the pace of change for Windows 10 is happening now faster than in many cases organizations can deploy new physical devices. The process optimization feature within Stratusphere UX profoundly helps you to extend the life of those older PCs. Again, I can't magically make resources appear where they don't already physically exist, but I can prioritize resources to create a higher level of user satisfaction and user experience by ensuring that the applications in focus are getting a priority set of resources available to them. From an unplanned standpoint, things like malware and ransomware, which some of which are orchestrated or designed specifically to consume background resources and essentially hold a PC hostage. We are very successful in finding those and mitigate the effects of those. And with the reporting and with the ability to capture all of this information and report on it within Stratusphere, you now have a remediation path to go back and identify which applications have been offenders most often, where are they, how often are they running, what versions are they, and now you have a feedback loop by which you can go and now optimize and be more proactive about ensuring that workspaces have the resources available. This helps you also from a management and utilization standpoint to cast that safety net. Whether you're deploying a brand new application and perhaps haven't been able to fully test what its resource consumption patterns look like, or perhaps a Windows update or an application update that got automatically deployed or was deployed without your knowledge, this can now act as that safety net to ensure that when you have new image rollout, any of those small, minor sort of punch list items that sneak through are still caught, and you still have a protection to minimize risk until you have an opportunity to go back and remediate. And some greater resource efficiency, right? In terms of reclaiming CPU, in terms of reclaiming RAM and making it available for desktop environments, this is a great way for you to ensure that you get the best experience possible from some of your shared infrastructure and from some of the shared resource delivery when it relates to on-prem virtual delivery. So overall, eliminating barriers with process optimization, really great in the 4 use cases that I talked about, whether it's a resource issue as it relates to Windows and the increasing march and frequency of Windows updates, whether it's the move to cloud and virtual-based workspaces, whereby there's a stark and a growing set of resource availability or change in resource availability when you look at physical available resources versus virtual on-prem or cloud-delivered workspaces. It's a means for you to minimize risk and define a safety net for yourself as it relates to user behavior and those things that you just simply can't easily control. For example, applications like Google and those users that just insist on having 40 tabs open in Chrome all the time. This gives you a little bit of a safety net for those users to ensure that, if appropriate, Chrome is prioritized and it's getting as many of those resources as it possibly can. And then spontaneous. We talked a little bit about spontaneous mishaps and spontaneous availability of resource consumption and other patterns and other applications or processes or malware, etc. This can act as a safety net to protect against some of those spontaneous mishaps. And lastly, and most importantly, this is a feature set within Stratusphere. For our existing Stratusphere customers, there is no more resources consumed. There's no additional software that needs to be installed. It's simply a checkbox in our connector ID key settings to deploy this. So no additional cost, no additional management overhead. It's extremely easy. It's non-invasive, and it's defined really from the ground up to be easy and a set it and forget it type of feature set as it relates to operations and ongoing management. I want to offer all of you an opportunity to download a white paper that we've had available for a little while. This is a white paper on user experience and why it's so important. It's not simply targeted at physical or virtual on-prem or workspaces delivered via the cloud. It is about end user experience, full stop, and how operationalizing and managing your end user workspaces with an eye for analytics and capturing information and optimization opportunity is really key. Whether it's defining a baseline of normal, whether it's setting goals for functionality surrounding performance and user experience, and again, continuing to monitor, continuing to look at diagnostics when the wheels come off the bus, making sure you have the tools, the trending information, and the ability to provide a forensic diagnostics exercise. Looking at user experience is really, really key. Go take a look at it. There's a bunch of other really excellent white papers available on our website. And with that, I'd love to perhaps throw things back to Ray and entertain any questions that we may have today.
Thanks, Kevin. We do have a few questions here, and so just a reminder, if you do have any questions or comments for us, please feel free to put them in the questions field or the chat box, and we'll get to them, but here's a couple of them. Can you share a bit more about how you set options for optimization?
Absolutely. Really, really great question. So process optimization and the settings that we afford you in the SID key settings, in our lightweight agent settings, allow you to define sort of aggressiveness based on both workspace type, whether it's physical or VDI, or whether it's multi-user and shared, right? Whether it's an RDS, a XenApp, WVD type of an environment. I won't get into too much of the nitty-gritty. I can certainly take some of that offline, but we've really tried to define these protocols based on some consideration, right? Based on the frequency of use, based on how often or aggressive we believe the memory settings are going to be, whether the primary motivation is to mitigate runaway process versus mitigate long-term freezes, whether it's about setting an aggressiveness threshold that's tied to number of cores, either logical or virtual, or whether it's tied to number of user ratio or user density to core. So we've done a couple of things to really make this easy for folks. There's a conservative and a sort of recommended or a little more aggressive setting for single user machines. There's a setting that's specifically tuned for virtual desktop infrastructure oriented machines. And then there's a multi-user setting that's really defined for multi-user types of environments. Think terminal services, RDS, XenApp, WVD, etc. So we've really tried to take a lot of the effort off of you to turn the dials and tweak some of this, and we've built some profiles that we found work very, very well with many, if not all, of the broad stroke use cases that we've seen.
Okay, great. Here's a question. How can Liquidware augment a CMDB?
Well, that's a new one. I'm not sure what that is, so I will have to ask the Google and get back to the individual who asked that question. I'm just not prepared to answer that. I apologize.
All right. It looks like they're following up configuration management database. So, anyways, I think some people are chiming in trying to clarify that a little bit.
Yeah, so. we'll get back to that individual. I apologize.
Yeah. Let's see here. How do you protect necessary processes?
Oh, that's a great question, right? So there are certainly, from a best practice standpoint, and from a platform delivery standpoint, there are processes and collections of processes that we really don't want to fool with. By way of example, you don't want to optimize things like antivirus. You don't want to throttle or optimize anything that is involved in the delivery of your workspace itself. So think about things like your VM tools directory, any of the directories that are provided by the platforms, whether it's VMware or Citrix or others. And so we offer the ability for you to omit complete subdirectories from process optimization, as well as the ability to specifically whitelist or blacklist certain applications from being highlighted or optimized. So there's a number of different ways to do it, but we've really tried to make this very non-invasive overall, both in terms of the setting and the hurdle that you need to get over to make it work, but more importantly, to make sure that we do not, under any circumstances, affect the performance through the operation of trying to optimize your processes.
All right. Here's another one. Someone asked, can you rotate the agent installed on the desktop if you want to randomly monitor them?
Can I rotate the agent in case I want to randomly monitor them? I'm not entirely sure what we're getting at here, but let me say that Stratusphere, by default, Stratusphere has always allowed you to install our connector ID key, our lightweight agent, and you define a sample interval as well as a callback frequency. So for example, you can have Stratusphere look at your environment every 5 minutes and then package up all that information and send it off to the database once every 15 minutes or once every 30 minutes. You administratively define that sample interval, and Stratusphere marches forward and does it every single time that sample interval comes around. So we could, in theory, create a instance where Stratusphere is collecting information every 5 minutes. That's a look at everything going on in your environment. There's well over 250 metrics collected at each one of these sample intervals, and you could define a data retention period of 120 days. I would have a sample every 5 minutes for 120 days. It's a lot of information. And we've done some very huge Herculean efforts with our database to ensure that we strike a balance between data set, usability, action, being able to take action on that information, but also speed at which that action or that availability of that data set is made to you. So I'm not quite sure what you mean by rotate if you want to randomly monitor. We're kind of looking at them all the time. If you wanted to look from a monitoring or from a diagnostic standpoint at what a machine was doing 5 minutes before the user called the help desk, we have that information already. If you wanted to see what that user was doing on Thursday at 12 noon for the last 6 Thursdays, we already have that information. So Stratusphere is not a point in time monitoring solution where you only look or only see what's going on within a machine when you focus on it. We have all data on all of your machines, all of your users, and all of your applications all of the time.
All right. So I think you kind of started to touch on this a little bit, but I think this question kind of goes hand in hand. So let's do this one next. And someone asked, what type of resources does your agent require?
Oh, that's a really great one. I love this question. So Stratusphere, of course, is, as I've mentioned, is looking at every single application. In fact, we look at every single process on your machine. And when I say every single process, I mean how much RAM it consumes, how much CPU it consumes, how much I/O it consumes, total send and receive, kilobits or kilobytes. I look at if it opens a network port, where it's opening that port to. I can look at the source, the destination. I can do trace routes. There is an obscene amount of granularity, both in terms of depth and breadth of information that Stratusphere collects. Stratusphere also collects information on our own agent. And so there's really nowhere to hide. We are hyper focused on ensuring that we strike the perfect balance between resource consumption of our own agent versus being able to make sure we pull out the information and can grab the right information from individual machines and individual workspaces with a primary sort of core prime directive of do no harm. So we are hyper focused on ensuring that the collector ID key, the connection agent within Stratusphere, is never doing any harm to the user experience itself. Broadly, we measure our own utilization to be between about 10 and 20 megabytes in terms of its disk size, that it consumes roughly 25 to 40 megabytes of space when resident in RAM. It's about a half to a percent, typically more towards the smaller end, of half of 1% of CPU that's consumed. And the network callback is going to somewhat vary based on the number of samples per callback interval, but on average, we see a callback in the 80 to 100 kilobit range per individual machine callback. So hopefully you'll see very small resource consumption, very little in terms of what we're consuming as compared to the benefit and the amount of information that we're able to extrapolate, trend, and provide to you to the benefit of managing performance and user experience.
All right, questions keep rolling in, so we'll keep going. And someone asked, does Liquidware have a report to inventory all VMs, even those without an agent installed on the desktop?
It does. Great question. So in many cases, we capture and time correlate information as presented from different sources. So, for example, we talked about the in-guest agent, and we talked about how the in-guest agent behaves. We also have the ability to collect information from network stations. We have the ability to grab sort of wire data with those network stations. We have the ability to fully synchronize with Active Directory and other directory on the back end to support sorting, filtering, and searching through the database of information. And we also support the ability to grab host and infrastructure-centric metrics through either things like Windows when installed on Windows multi-session host, but also through things like vCenter and Prism. So for Nutanix infrastructure, for vCenter-centric infrastructure, we have the ability to look at things like vhost and vmachine-centric information and allow you to compare that to the in-guest aggregate view, and certainly all of that information can be reported on as well.
Great. Someone asked, in a previous screen you had a drop down for profiles. Can you talk about what profiles are available and the differences?
Yeah, I can talk sort of briefly about it. So there are 5 profiles available presently in process optimization, and as I said, there are 2 that are available for multi-session environments. So there's an RDS sort of XenApp WVD type of an environment. One is more aggressive than the other, and aggressiveness is essentially determined based on things like, or should be determined based on things like core to user ratio and some of the sort of how aggressive you want memory savings to be on each of those platforms broadly, and whether you're looking at things like runaway process or long freezes as sort of the predominant mechanism that you're providing safety or risk aversion to. From a single use perspective, there are 2 that are geared or tuned today more so to physical types of devices, and one that is tuned more to single-use virtual types of environments. And again, the way in which you would choose one over the other would be based on things like how many cores they have, whether you're looking to focus more so on memory savings or aggressiveness of being able to free up memory. There's a lot of detail in terms of how often or what the time cadence looks like for how long we allow a process to run before it takes action. So there's a number of sort of behind the scenes resources and variables that are considered. And I believe we still do offer the ability to tune all of these via an ini file as well. So if you don't like what we've done with the pull downs, there's a lot of other configuration that can be done, and that's also documented and available with some help through our support team.
All right, someone asked, are there user-defined alerts that can be broadcast to a given set of managers?
Yeah, that's a great question. We certainly do have alerts, and our alerting capabilities are continuing to grow. But we absolutely have the ability to define machine-centric alerts broadly based on utilization, application-centric alerts, utilization-centric alerts, and they can be sort of ramped up based on a percentage of your overall user pool, or every time we see an instance, you can alert on it. Alerting is supported through traditional SNMP traps. There's also the ability to define email addresses. We can send alerts to common help desk and other supported platforms. And I should also mention we have a full, complete API that allows you to pull information out of Stratusphere and populate that into other supporting infrastructure, monitoring, and help desk tools. We have many customers who use this API to flow user-centric metrics and information into tools like Remedy, for example. So when a user calls into a help desk, the phone rings, the help desk does a screen pop, and now Remedy can grab a table of information on that particular user for the last hour, for example, and show you what the user experienced as reported by our in-guest agent within Stratusphere. So there's a number of ways in which you can either alert and or get near real-time access to the information for the benefit of immediate remediation and first-tier support.
All right, we've got a few more questions yet still. One of them is, can this be used to increase VDI density?
That's a great question, and I really like the question for a number of reasons. But let me first say, there's no magic here in terms of being able to create more resource, right? So if you've got a multi-session host and that multi-session host has 100 gig of RAM available to us, whatever you provision as the available RAM to each individual machine is what you've got available. I'm not creating something from nothing. What I'm doing, however, is I'm allowing you to more effectively manage and more effectively to utilize that RAM. So, for example, you may be able to get a slightly higher density if you're more comfortable having less overhead or less sort of overhead in terms of the shared resources on a given pod. That is to say, you can size a pod in multiple different ways. You can size it based on average, or you can size it based on worst case scenario. If you're sizing based on average, you may be able to move a little closer to that worst case scenario and sneak a few more users onto that pod. So the short answer is, yeah, maybe you could get a few more users on that pod. But broadly, we're looking to protect individual users from running low on utilization and having a poor user experience. So what I would say is you will have a greater aggregate user experience for all of the users on a pod with optimization versus without optimization, given an equal number of users. So that's not to say we're going to specifically give you a lot more resource availability. We're just going to allow you to leverage it, manage it, and prioritize on those applications that are in focus, thereby gaining an overall increase in user experience.
All right, so we've only got a few more minutes here, so I'm going to start kind of combining some of the questions here to cover multiple stones with one answer maybe. And there's a couple questions here regarding the cost of Stratusphere and wondering how it's licensed. Somebody asked specifically what would be the expected cost to monitor all the desktops in their environment.
Great question. Stratusphere is licensed in a couple ways. Based on named user, we also have a concurrency model available. In terms of field pricing, we have ELAs, and based on the size of the deal, there are sort of different schedules in place. But from an MSRP standpoint, Stratusphere retails for $49 per named user. Named user can have multiple desktop machines or multiple machines that they log into. So for example, the user Kevin Cooke might have a physical PC, might have a virtual PC, might have a multi-session XenApp instance that I log into. As long as that Kevin Cooke is the same Active Directory instance of Kevin Cooke, that's one license for all of the machines that I just mentioned. So from a licensing standpoint, license per machine. Per named user. The process optimization feature is inclusive or is included in that license cost. So there's no additional cost for that feature that we spoke about today.
All right. Someone asked, could you compare the value proposition between Liquidware and VMware Workspace ONE? How are you different, or how do you both augment each other?
Oh, good question. So broadly, VMware, and I'll speak broadly sort of to their platform, as I'm sure many of you are aware, the Horizon platform and View and the various components have similar feature sets when you look at the broad stroke buckets that I outlined earlier of user environment management, application layering, and user experience visibility, monitoring, and diagnostics. So on paper, we look pretty similar. And let me also be clear, Liquidware is not the platform vendor. So you would still require some type of platform if you were delivering an on-prem virtual desktop infrastructure, an on-prem application delivery infrastructure. You would still need, in many cases, some type of platform if you were looking to virtualize your infrastructure broadly. So really where it comes down to is the key features of user experience, visibility, application layering, and user environment management. That's where there are similarities. Now, broadly, from a cost perspective, moving from the base VMware toolset to the top tier toolset where you get those features from VMware directly, our suite of products, our adaptive workspace management suite of products, are going to be less costly to you with a greater feature set. So we're going to have significantly more granularity in terms of feature set, significantly more ability to manage, operationalize, uh, in many cases, greater performance. Speaking specifically to visibility, the VROPS tool that you get from VMware is really an infrastructure-centric tool that has some end-user computing-oriented visibility, but it is not capturing persistent workspace analytics over time. It's really only giving you a single point in view, what I would call a one-to-one view of individual instances at a single point in time. Whereas Stratusphere, on the other hand, is looking at all of your users and all of your workspaces all of the time. And that brings up another key difference is the VMware toolset is typically only applicable to those workspaces that you run on a VMware infrastructure. If you want a user experience view of all of your Windows devices, whether they're physical, virtual, cloud, or a hybrid of all of the above, we are not infrastructure or platform dependent. And that's the case with all of the adaptive workspace management solutions and the three sub components of the Liquidware feature set. They're completely agnostic as it relates to our ability to look at and manage and optimize your Windows environment. Full stop. Right. So if you're only looking to deliver for Windows and you have very simplistic use cases, you may be okay with their tool set. If, however, you need to go above and beyond, you need more granularity in terms of your ability to manage, to optimize, or to affect in a positive way the user experience, and you need to do that beyond the VMware platform from a single point of view, from a single console, from a single pane of glass perspective, then Liquidware is going to be a far better solution for you in that regard.
All right, I know we're at our time, but there's only one or two more questions. So Kevin, you got another minute for a couple more questions?
Of course I do.
All right. So someone said it's been a while since they looked, but does Stratusphere AMI for AWS support M5, M5A instance types now?
Wow, that's a specific question. I believe the short answer is yes. Broadly, we are not necessarily tied to the Amazon infrastructure or the Amazon profiles or the different Amazon workspaces that are delivered. So whether it's a Windows workspace or even a Linux workspace, I should mention Stratusphere Agent will natively install in Windows and most of the major Linux distributions and Macintosh now. We will install and support and give you that in-guest perspective. So there's really no specific tie-ins to backend or to specific profile types. It just kind of works, I guess, is the short answer.
Okay. Someone asks, how complex is the solution to implement?
Well, Stratusphere is extremely easy to implement. It is delivered as a series of virtual appliances. Those virtual appliances are downloaded, whether they're AMIs or OVFs, from our download page. The hardest thing is typically waiting for all the bits to get down to you. But once you've got everything local, installing them is pretty straightforward and pretty trivial. The database is inclusive, so there's no additional cost or really overhead in terms of setup time. And installing our SID keys is pretty straightforward on physical or non-persistent, or I should say on physical or persistent. You can use whatever your favorite software distribution tool is. On multi-session, non-persistent, we have a best practice in terms of how to serialize and how to make sure that they're installed and baked into your golden image appropriately. But broadly, we find that a somewhat knowledgeable technical person can get Stratusphere installed up and running in under a half an hour. Deploying SIDs to your entire environment can take some time depending on how large your environment is and what type of mechanism you use to install those agents. But but broadly, we've really made the install process pretty simple, pretty straightforward. We run on just about any major industry-supported hypervisor, and in the case of cloud, I should mention Stratusphere 6.1.3 will be up and available on the Amazon Marketplace, we hope, shortly. And with 6.1.3 in Amazon Marketplace, you can actually run Amazon from Marketplace. So, very, very, very little, even in terms of resources now required, other than paying for your cloud-consumed resources. You can get Stratusphere up in Marketplace for very little cost to sort of kick the tires and very, very little investment in your time to get it set up, installed, and configured.
All right, Kevin, last one because we're about 5 minutes over right now. And someone asks, is UX 6.1.3 available now for all to download?
Yeah, as I've said, 6.1.3, I've been communicating even during this call with our development and QA. It's been cleared by QA, so it's really just a matter of us getting everything online and available, and that should happen hopefully a bit later this afternoon. So 6.1.3 is imminently going to be available to you all.
All right, great. Thanks, Kevin. We appreciate all your time on this and everyone for all the questions. We hope that you found some valuable information in there, because I know there was lots of information in there, which leads me to remember to keep an eye on your inbox in the days following the event for a link to the recording. So if you want to share any of these answers or go back and review anything, we've got that out there. So with that being said, thank you all for attending, and thank you, Kevin.
My pleasure. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.